In a letter to Washington Redskins fans, owners Daniel Snyder addressed what he believes is a sympathetic audience. Defending the name of the Redskins, Snyder says it's who we are. He writes, Washington Redskins is more than a name we have called our football team for over 8 decades. It is a symbol of everything we stand for: strength, courage, pride, and respect. The same values we know guide Native Americans and which are embedded throughout their rich history as the original Americans. Well, one Native American group quickly responded by saying Snyder clearly does not understand the consequences here. Stephen A., I'll ask you this first because we're putting Daniel Snyder on the hook. Does it sound like he's willing to change the name at all?
It does not. It didn't come across that way at all to me. A matter of fact, I thought that he made a case for keeping the name. I think that the letter that he wrote, I spoke to numerous guys. Remember, I've got family and friends in the Washington, D.C. area, some of whom are Redskins fans, that loved his letter to the fans. They absolutely positively applauded it. And so when you take that into consideration, it doesn't come across as him making any move whatsoever towards modifying things and changing the team's name and eradicating Redskins from the National Football League vernacular. I got to tell you, Skip, that for me, it's incredibly challenging for me to continue to take the position that I've taken for so long, and that is that this name should be changed. Obviously, to some degree, I still feel that way, but I'm not Native American. And when I read this letter, it does provoke me, and it gives me cause to pause, because when you consider the fact that he's saying right here, Skip, if you think about this right here, I'm reading, I got the letter right in front of me. It's talking about how, 81 years ago, in 1932, the team's name was the Boston Braves. The following year, the franchise was changed to the Boston Redskins. On that inaugural Redskins team, 4 players and our head coach were Native Americans. Then he goes on to say a little bit later that the Annenberg Public Policy Center polled nearly 1,000 self-identified Native Americans from across the continental U.S. and found that 90% of Native Americans did not find the team name Washington Redskins to be offensive. The Associated Press, 79% of the respondents from a 2013 poll stated the Redskins should not change their name. I mean, I'm looking at this stuff, article in the Washington Post. Paul Woody, a columnist for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, interviewed Native Americans from the Virginia area that also didn't find that name offensive. It does lend itself towards validating the position that Daniel Snyder has taken, that, this name is not offensive. They themselves are saying it's not offensive. See, I was under the impression, and I continue to some degree to believe, that there are an abundance of Native Americans that vehemently find this to be an offensive label. And as a result, my thinking is, if it's offensive, then something needs to be done about it, because we live in a society where we're trying to eradicate all of that stuff. And anything that's offensive to somebody outside the offended party doesn't get to define what's offensive to that offended party. But if Native Americans themselves are standing up and saying, this is not offensive to us, we take pride in the Washington Redskins name, then that's a different argument. So again, I don't know if everything that Daniel Snyder wrote in his letter to the fans is true. But if it is true, and Native Americans themselves, a vast majority of them, are saying this is not offensive, then even though I still am, I'm still a bit shaky about it, Skip, it's hard for me to stand up vehemently proclaiming that it is something that the Washington Redskins need to change, if indeed Native Americans are out there saying it doesn't need to be changed. Because I'm not a Native American. I don't know.
So Dan Snyder's letter has pretty much convinced you to back off your stance of the last couple of days.
It's convinced me that we really need to find out specifically what the Native American population in this country feels about this, because it seems to be all over the map as to whether they're offended or not offended by it. We need to definitively define if they are offended or not. If they are, I maintain my position. If it's true that they're not offended by this, what am I to say?
So
That's my position.
You're starting to believe that this is more media-driven than it is an actual fact that enough Native Americans are offended by it to change. You're starting to wonder if that many Native Americans are that offended.
I'm starting to wonder if that many Native Americans are offended. If you have Native Americans that are saying they're not offended by this, and by and large their numbers eclipse the few who say they do find it offensive, then to me you have a problem if you're one of those Native American groups that wants this name change. If you've got people of your own community saying, no, you're wrong, this doesn't offend us, that's a problem, but I'm not qualified to speak for them on that, Skip. I'm just saying I need to know.
Yet I thought you and I have agreed over the years that if even one member of a cultural or racial group is offended by a term, then it should be offensive to all of us. We've basically said that, right?
Well, you know, when have we said that, Skip? If you're talking about the N-word, universally recognized, that's offensive. That's offensive.
Okay.
And I don't care who you talk to in the black community.
We've talked about hazier words that are sort of in the middle, where we're not sure how offensive the word is, but we always conclude, hey, if one member of that group finds it offensive, then we should find it offensive. And to me, it's not just one member of the Native Americans. Even yesterday, that Oneida Indian Nation group stepped right up and said, this is a racial slur, and we continue to be offended. There have been several in the recent past Native American groups that have stepped up and said, we find the term Redskins offensive. I don't think it's just media-driven. Are we going to be able to poll every Native American in this country? I don't know. I wish we could. It would help a little bit, but if even 2% were offended, I'd say, I don't think it works. And I'm just going to tell you again from my heart what I've always thought of that term. And maybe I've watched too many Westerns, but I did grow up in what used to be called Indian Territory, home of the 5 civilized tribes, the state of Oklahoma. So it is a little dear to my heart, even though I don't have any Native American blood in me. But to me, I grew up thinking, maybe from Westerns, that the term Redskins was incredibly derogatory. Maybe not inward derogatory, but even in the Westerns, it was used as, we've got to go get those Redskins. You know, it's a terrible term. And again, I've turned it around to you, and if there were any sort of similar term used to describe the black community and used as a nickname, as a badge of honor for a team, I think you would be offended by it.
Yes, I would.
It's just offensive to me, and again, Dan Snyder reaches for what a lot of the teams reach for. It's a badge of honor for us. It's a symbol of everything we stand for: strength, courage, pride, respect. Well, and again, maybe I don't know what I'm talking about, but the nickname Atlanta Braves, I can see where you took Braves. I know when I was a little kid, I grew up wanting to be an Indian Brave. That was a big deal to me. I thought that was the most powerful thing on earth, was to be a Brave. I wish I could have been in that culture. But the idea of a brave is literally brave. So I could see where you could defend that term. And I don't hear that many people say we don't like the term Braves in the Native American culture. But to go flat out Redskins, it's just terrible to me. And again, Snyder can say, well, it's who we are. It's what we've always stood for. And as an organization, we stand for courage and strength and honor and valor and all those great things. But again, I think you're making a leap from the term to what it stands for you. And I think basically he's just saying, don't ruin our tradition. We grew up singing Hail to the Redskins, and his father sang it, and Dan sang it as a little kid, so it's dear to his heart. But I don't think it's dear to the hearts of every Native American. So I think there's still a problem, and I think this letter is going to be so effective. I think Dan Snyder is going to now dig in, and as long as he owns the Redskins, I don't think they're going to change. I think he convinced a lot of people with a very effective letter that convinced you.
Well, I would ask you to be very, very careful about words that you attach to me, like the last word you just used, convinced. What I said was, Skip Bayless, he writes this letter, and in the letter, he is talking about what Native Americans feel. He is saying that is what their research shows. I am saying, if I am offended for the Native Americans and I am giving a voice to the relative voiceless, okay, that is a different ballgame, because again, if they are offended, people need to speak up for them. If you're making the argument, if you're Daniel Snyder, that they're offended and you don't care because this is what it means to me and this is what it means to Redskins Nation, then that is a different argument, and there's no way in hell I would ever support that. But if you're saying, no, you all have it wrong, these people are not offended by this. They hold this as a badge of honor. We have numbers, we have statistics, we have polls, we have quotes, we have people on the record willing to acknowledge this in an abundance of numbers to support our position. Then as somebody who is not a Native American, I have an obligation to pay attention to that because I don't know. Now, if you want to sit there and look at me and say that as a black person, let's use the analogy of the N-word. Talk to me about one black person who's not going to find the N-word being offensive coming from somebody outside the black community. That's the real deal. And then you because universally it's recognized as something that is incredibly sensitive and incredibly offensive. And for all of those white folks out there who think that it's okay because somebody might utter that word, well, if you're so confident, walk outside the locker room, walk into the street, walk into a black neighborhood and utter that word, and you don't happen to be black, and watch what happens to you. What Daniel Snyder is saying as it pertains to the Native Americans, however, is that if you ask them, get him out of the equation, get the Washington Redskins out of the equation, they're telling you that this is something they don't find offensive. We don't understand where y'all are getting all of this from. Then it's something we need to pay attention to. It doesn't mean I've completely changed my position. It means that it's giving me cause to pause, because I said I got to look more into this because I'm not a Native American, and this man is saying they don't find it offensive. I didn't get the impression that he's saying I don't care that they find it offensive. I got the impression he's saying, excuse me, they don't find it offensive. Y'all are exaggerating and embellishing this. That's what I got from Daniel Snyder, and that's what I need clarification on. That's what I'm saying.
I'm going to ask you one more time. Yesterday, the Oneida Indian Nation, their spokesman, said this is a racial slur that continues to have and has had very serious cultural, political, and public health consequences for my people. Now, are you telling me that group is just attention-seeking, sympathy-seeking, that you're going to dismiss that group?
I'm not accusing them of that. I'm not saying they should be summarily dismissed. But guess what, Skip? If you have an abundance of other Indian tribes that would stand front and center with them and say to them, excuse me, we're from the same tribe, we are Native Americans, excuse me, we don't find that offensive, you now have a problem. If you're the only other Indian tribe, you now have a problem, because there are an abundance of people of your kind who says this is not offensive. That is a problem for them.
Skip,
it absolutely is.
Skip, let me make sure I understand. You're saying if any part of any group feels offended, it's offensive. End of story.
Well, we've always talked about that on this show, and I thought that was pretty much our rule of thumb here. And Stephen, let me throw one last quick point at you, because you brought up the use of the N-word. There's the obvious modernized use of the N-word within the black community that ends in A. And yet, I know for a fact. What's that?
He said ignorant.
That's pure ignorance.
Okay,
go ahead.
But it's a split in the black community. I've heard from several people who believe it's okay, and several of people I know here at ESPN who are black don't believe it's okay. So I'm just saying that there's a split. It's just like with the Redskins. I'm sure it's a split in the Native American nation over whether it's okay or not okay.
First of all, let me be very, very clear, because there's not enough black people that are comfortable in saying what I'm about to say. But let me put it right out there. Those people who try to divide, to basically have a line where it says that it's okay whether it ends in ER or the difference is ER as opposed to A or whatever. That's just pure ignorance. And I'm really getting sick and tired of television networks, not this one, but I'm getting sick and tired of television networks that find the most ignorant folks you could find, all right, that have a limited, that's right, I'm going to say it, some, certainly not most, not all, but there's a few, can't even put a daggone sentence together. They'll flash the camera on them, have no concept of history, have no context to attach it to whatsoever, and they'll sit there and flash the camera in front of them and act like they speak for a bunch of black people. That's just a lie. It's ignorant. It makes no sense. It has nothing to do with us. That's number one. But number two, and more importantly, I'm going to get back to my original statement to you, Skip, when it comes to that whole issue, that whole controversy. Whether it ends with the A or the ER, you're somebody outside the black community.
Can't say
You're
it.
so confident that it's okay to say, roll in the black community and go ahead and say it.
Completely
and watch
agree.
what happens.
Yes.
Can't say
But I
it.
was making the point to you that there's some split in the black community over whether the N-word ending in A has become a fraternal, like a love word, took a hate word that ended in ER and made it a love word within the black community. We've talked on the show. Go ahead.
I'm telling you that when people have alluded to that, even the ignorant, the few ignorant amongst our community, when they have alluded to it, they are talking about how we choose to communicate with one another, not somebody outside of our community feeling comfortable enough to come and utter those words in front of us. See, the universal impact is, we have that. Trust me. And if you doubt it, be somebody outside the black community and roll in our black community and say it and watch what happens. Watch.
All right, let's leave it right there. Really quickly, I'll add this, and Stephen A., understanding your point, they did a poll in the Washington Post, and they asked, should they change the name? That's the local paper. 60% of the people say no. Still a mixed bag there. We will have more First Take after the break. Stick around, everyone.